November 21, 1943. Allied headquarters in Algiers. The radio transcript lay on the table, already circulating through Washington. The words were no longer containable. A senior American general had struck 2 enlisted men in field hospitals, threatened one with a pistol, and called both cowards. The broadcast had turned a sealed incident into a public fact. Dwight D. Eisenhower was not alone in the room. His chief of staff stood nearby. Legal officers had already outlined the options. A formal investigation would trigger automatic relief. Court-martial was unavoidable once the machinery started. Congress would demand it. The press would insist on it. The Army's regulations allowed no ambiguity. Eisenhower made his decision there, not later, not after consultation with Washington, and not after public pressure subsided. He would not initiate a formal inquiry. He would not remove the officer in question from the Army. He would contain the damage inside the chain of command and absorb the political cost himself. The man at the center of the scandal was George S. Patton, commander of 7th Army, already sidelined since Sicily. Eisenhower ordered that Patton issue personal apologies to the men he struck, then travel unit by unit to apologize publicly to soldiers under his former command. He stripped him of operational authority and froze his career progression. No press statement would defend him. No public explanation would contextualize the decision. Silence would be the policy. This was not clemency. It was control. Eisenhower understood exactly what he was preserving. He also understood what he was sacrificing. By refusing to act publicly, he accepted responsibility for the consequences. If Patton failed again, the blame would be Eisenhower's. If morale cracked, it would be Eisenhower's failure. If Congress forced the issue, Eisenhower would answer for it alone. The decision closed the file before it could be opened. The paperwork that would have ended Patton's career was never written. The order to proceed with discipline but not dismissal moved down the chain. The war went on, carrying the weight of that choice forward with it. Stop. At that moment, the military opportunity was clear, measurable, and already proven. Patton was not an untested liability whose removal carried minimal cost. He was a functioning weapon the Allied command had already used and would need again. By August 1943, the United States Army had only one senior commander who consistently demonstrated operational speed at scale. Not localized aggressiveness. Not isolated tactical brilliance. Sustained momentum across hundreds of miles, under logistical strain, against a retreating but still lethal enemy. That commander was Patton. In North Africa, after the collapse at Kasserine, he had taken over a broken corps and restored combat effectiveness in weeks. Discipline tightened. Movement accelerated. German commanders noticed immediately. In Sicily, his 7th Army advanced faster than Allied planners believed possible, outpacing British formations that had been assigned the main effort. His columns seized ports, airfields, and road networks before German withdrawals could fully organize. He did not win Sicily cleanly, but he won it quickly. Speed was not a stylistic preference. It was the one advantage the Western Allies possessed that Germany could not replace. The Wehrmacht could still fight. It could still concentrate armor locally. What it could not do was absorb repeated operational shocks without time to rebuild. Patton denied time. Removing him entirely would not create a neutral outcome. It would create a vacuum. The remaining senior American commanders were competent, cautious, and politically acceptable. None had demonstrated Patton's willingness to accept operational risk to maintain tempo. None inspired the same fixation inside German intelligence. This fixation mattered. By mid-1943, German planners tracked Patton as a specific threat variable. His presence distorted their expectations. His absence would be noticed. Removing him permanently would simplify German forecasting at the exact moment the Allies were preparing the largest amphibious invasion in history. There was also the matter of deception. Allied planners were already building the framework for misdirection in advance of the cross-channel assault. That deception required a believable spearhead. It required an enemy commander the Germans already feared, already studied, already expected to lead the decisive blow. No other Allied general fit that role. From a purely military standpoint, the optimal course was not punishment or absolution. It was controlled retention. Neutralize the liability. Preserve the asset. Patton could be sidelined without being destroyed. He could be removed from active command without signaling weakness. He could be used indirectly, symbolically, psychologically. That option disappeared the moment a court-martial began. A formal proceeding would do more than remove a general. It would redefine acceptable command behavior in the middle of a total war. It would tell every field commander that psychological collapse under artillery was an excuse, not a condition to be managed. It would tell aggressive officers that political optics now outweighed battlefield results. The army would become safer. It would also become slower. The opportunity, then, was narrow and time-bound. Keep Patton in uniform. Strip him of authority. Let public anger exhaust itself. Reintroduce him when operational speed again became indispensable. This was not a gamble based on faith in Patton's character. It was a calculation based on the absence of a substitute. The Allied command did not ask whether Patton deserved to stay. It asked whether the war could be won as quickly without him. At that moment, the answer was no. Stop. Patton had already understood the danger before anyone above him acted. Not the danger to his career, but the danger to the army if his behavior was allowed to stand unexamined. His private correspondence and internal memoranda from Sicily show no confusion about what he had done. They show preparation. He did not deny striking the men. He did not attempt to redefine the events. Instead, he framed them as command failures that required containment. His concern was not public outrage. It was loss of usefulness. Patton had spent his entire career studying how armies break before they are destroyed. He understood morale as a physical quantity, not an abstract one. Units that believe their commander will hesitate move slower. Units that believe collapse is tolerated collapse more often. His fixation on discipline was extreme, but it was not improvised. It was systematic. Before Sicily, Patton had already issued guidance on psychiatric casualties that went beyond doctrine. He believed psychological collapse spread through formations the way panic spreads through crowds. He did not deny its existence. He denied its legitimacy. That distinction mattered to him. He prepared his subordinates to suppress it aggressively, even at reputational cost. What Patton underestimated was the institutional shift occurring around him. By 1943, the U.S. Army Medical Corps had formally recognized combat fatigue as a diagnosable condition. Evacuation and treatment protocols were expanding. Patton's internal model was colliding with an evolving army that now viewed psychological injury as unavoidable rather than shameful. After the incidents, Patton did not fight the army's position. He adjusted to it. His letters to Eisenhower were restrained, factual, and devoid of self-defense. He accepted censure. He accepted removal from command. He did not argue for reinstatement. He argued for future utility. His preparation took a different form. While sidelined, Patton immersed himself in operational planning for the next phase of the war. He studied amphibious logistics, deception doctrine, and German reserve movement patterns. He maintained contact with staff officers who would later form the core of Third Army headquarters. He refined the very skill set that Eisenhower would eventually need. Patton also understood how he was perceived by the enemy. He followed intelligence summaries that confirmed German fixation on his movements. He did not attempt to reduce that fixation. He amplified it quietly. Public appearances, inspections, visibility without authority. He allowed German intelligence to continue believing he was central. This was not rehabilitation. It was positioning. Patton made no effort to re-enter command prematurely. He did not lobby Congress. He did not speak to the press. He did not cultivate sympathy. Silence was his compliance. Preparation was his response. His subordinates noted the change. The volatility remained, but it was now channeled inward. He accepted humiliation without protest because protest would have triggered removal. He understood the boundary he had crossed and the conditions required to be allowed back inside it. What mattered to Patton was not vindication. It was relevance. He anticipated the next moment when speed would again be required, when caution would again fail, when an army built for mass would need a commander willing to move faster than comfort allowed. He prepared for that moment without knowing when it would come. This foresight made Eisenhower's containment strategy viable. A sidelined Patton who sulked would have been a liability. A sidelined Patton who planned became a reserve asset. The difference was discipline applied inward rather than outward. By the time the next crisis arrived, Patton was no longer the uncontrolled variable the incident suggested. He was a contained one, sharpened by delay, waiting for release under conditions set by others. Stop. The overrule did not arrive as a single command. It arrived as pressure, converging from multiple directions, each reinforcing the same conclusion while pretending no conclusion had yet been reached. Washington wanted accountability. Congress did not care about operational tempo or future campaigns. It cared about civilian control, public trust, and the image of an army that punished abuse. The War Department's lawyers warned that inaction would look like complicity. The Army Medical Corps warned that tolerating Patton's behavior would undermine their authority at the front. Eleanor Roosevelt's column made clear that silence would not protect the administration forever. The press was no longer cooperating. The self-imposed blackout had collapsed. Once the story aired, restraint became liability. Every day, without action, hardened the narrative that senior commanders protected their own at the expense of enlisted men. That narrative threatened more than Patton. It threatened the legitimacy of the officer corps. At the same time, the coalition was watching. British commanders had their own reasons for restraint. They distrusted Patton personally, but they understood his value strategically. More importantly, they understood the precedent. If the Americans publicly destroyed one of their most aggressive commanders under political pressure, British leadership would be exposed to the same vulnerability. Coalition warfare magnified institutional caution. Eisenhower stood at the intersection of these forces. He did not command a national army. He managed an alliance. His authority rested less on rank than on consent. Every decision had to preserve cohesion between governments, services, and personalities that did not answer to him directly. A court-martial would satisfy Washington but fracture confidence at the front. No field commander would believe future discipline was about performance rather than optics. Aggression would become a career risk. Initiative would narrow. Eisenhower understood this instinctively. He had spent his career observing what happened when institutions punished results because they disliked methods. Yet doing nothing was impossible. Silence would be interpreted as endorsement. Patton would become a symbol of impunity. That, too, would corrode discipline, just in a different direction. The compromise was containment disguised as punishment. Eisenhower chose administrative action precisely because it avoided precedent. No trial, no legal findings, no permanent record that could be cited later. Instead, a personal letter of reprimand, carefully worded to condemn behavior without litigating doctrine. The letter was not classified, but it was not publicized. It existed to be shown if necessary, not to be broadcast. The forced apologies were not about contrition. They were about inversion. Patton, who ruled by dominance, was required to submit publicly to the men he had commanded. The act stripped him of myth without erasing him. It reassured the army that authority still flowed downward from command, not upward from reputation. Most critically, Eisenhower removed Patton from operational relevance without removing him from the army. He denied him a command at the exact moment planning for the invasion of France accelerated. Other generals advanced. Patton did not. The message inside the officer corps was unmistakable. Results did not grant immunity, but they also did not guarantee erasure. This solution satisfied no one completely, which is how Eisenhower knew it was stable. Washington could claim discipline had occurred. The press could point to consequences. The medical establishment could assert its doctrine had been upheld. The army avoided rewriting its own code mid-war. The Germans saw no dismissal, no disgrace, no retreat from aggression. Their intelligence continued to track Patton as if nothing had changed. Eisenhower absorbed the remaining risk personally. He shielded his subordinates from congressional interrogation. He answered letters himself. He accepted that if Patton failed again, there would be no containment left. The next incident would not be managed. It would be terminal. This was the true overrule. Not Eisenhower overruling Washington or Patton overruling doctrine, but the system overruling clarity. The alliance could not afford a clean decision. It required ambiguity to survive. Patton remained in uniform not because he was forgiven, but because removing him cleanly would have simplified the war for the enemy and complicated it for everyone else. Eisenhower did not protect Patton. He preserved a tool while dismantling the myth that surrounded it. The institution bent around the problem rather than breaking it. That flexibility kept the coalition intact. It also ensured that when Patton returned, he would do so under conditions he did not control. Stop. The consequences unfolded slowly, then all at once. For nearly a year after Sicily, Patton existed without purpose. His rank remained. His authority did not. He attended briefings he did not control. He reviewed plans he would not execute. He watched officers he had once outranked move ahead of him. The delay was not accidental. It was the punishment Eisenhower had chosen precisely because it could not be appealed. During that interval, the Army moved without Patton's velocity. Operations advanced methodically. Lines were secured. Flanks were protected. Losses were accepted as the price of certainty. The Allied command structure rewarded predictability, and for a time, predictability worked. Then Normandy happened. The invasion succeeded, but it did not break Germany. The beachhead held. The breakout stalled. The hedgerows consumed men and machines faster than planners had forecast. German units, though weakened, demonstrated they could still slow a superior force when given time. Tempo collapsed into attrition. By July 1944, the limitation Eisenhower had tried to manage resurfaced as a strategic problem. The Allied armies were ashore, supplied, and numerically dominant. What they lacked was momentum. The Germans were retreating in order, not collapsing. Every day of delay gave them another line to man, another reserve to assemble, another defensive posture to improvise. At that moment, the consequences of keeping Patton became unavoidable. When he was finally given command of Third Army in August, the release was abrupt. There was no ceremony, no rehabilitation narrative. One order replaced months of silence. Patton moved immediately. The pattern that followed was not subtle. Third Army did not advance. It spilled. Supply officers lost track of forward elements. Flanks extended faster than maps could be updated. German commanders reported penetrations that did not conform to Allied doctrine. Patton did not seek decisive battles. He sought movement. The effect was cumulative. Entire German formations dissolved not because they were destroyed, but because they were bypassed repeatedly until cohesion failed. Prisoners arrived faster than rear areas could process them. Headquarters lost contact with subordinate units not because radios failed, but because no one knew where the front was anymore. This speed carried costs. Units outran fuel. Ammunition shortages forced improvisation. Friendly fire incidents increased. Patton accepted these risks without mitigation. He had been contained long enough. Now he spent authority as aggressively as he had once spent discipline. The Army adapted around him because it had to. Logistical systems bent. Air support became reactive rather than scheduled. Adjacent commanders adjusted their boundaries to accommodate movement they could not predict. The structure Eisenhower had preserved now absorbed the shock of unleashing it. The clearest demonstration came in December. When German forces struck through the Ardennes, the Allied front fractured. Command arrangements failed. Communications collapsed. For 48 hours, no one had a coherent picture. Eisenhower needed a response that did not require stabilization first. Patton provided it without hesitation. He redirected 3 divisions 90 degrees and moved them north through winter conditions that would have stopped other formations. This was not brilliance. It was refusal. Refusal to wait. Refusal to synchronize. Refusal to ask permission beyond the minimum required. The relief of Bastogne became evidence, not legend. It demonstrated what Eisenhower had preserved and what he had risked. Patton's return did not just blunt the German offensive. It restored Allied initiative at a moment when delay would have extended the war. The men Patton had once struck were not present to see this. Their experiences remained their own. But the army they served benefited from the decision to keep him. German commanders understood the shift immediately. Post-war interrogations confirmed what wartime intelligence had suspected. Patton's movements caused disproportionate alarm. Units repositioned prematurely. Reserves were committed too early. Defensive plans unraveled not because of Allied superiority, but because Patton's unpredictability compressed decision time beyond German capacity. This was the consequence Eisenhower had calculated months earlier. Not vindication. Not redemption. Utility. Patton did not become safer after his punishment. He became sharper. He operated within constraints only because Eisenhower imposed them. When those constraints were lifted, the system absorbed the risk because the alternative was stagnation. The casualties that followed were real. The speed saved lives in some places and cost them in others. That balance cannot be resolved cleanly. It can only be traced. Every mile Third Army advanced faster than its neighbors widened the gap between operational doctrine and operational reality. Eisenhower spent the remainder of the campaign managing that gap, redirecting resources, smoothing relationships, and containing Patton's excesses as much as exploiting his effectiveness. The decision to keep Patton did not end controversy. It deferred it. It pushed judgment forward into a context where outcomes could not be separated from methods. By the time Germany collapsed, Patton was again indispensable and again unacceptable. He spoke too freely. He antagonized allies. He challenged emerging political settlements. The same traits Eisenhower had contained once now resurfaced in a different form. But the war had been won. That outcome does not absolve the original act. It contextualizes it. The slap in Sicily remained indefensible. The threat with a pistol remained inexcusable. Eisenhower never reversed that assessment. He never claimed otherwise. What followed was not justification, but consequence. A decision made under pressure produced results that could not have been achieved as quickly without it. The cost was reputational damage, institutional compromise, and sustained moral ambiguity. The Army moved faster because Patton was allowed to return. It also accepted a commander it could not fully control. Eisenhower bore that tension deliberately. He did not resolve it. He managed it until the war ended. The consequence of saving Patton was not glory or disgrace. It was acceleration. And acceleration, once released, could not be recalled. Stop. The post-war record removed urgency and replaced it with documentation. What had been managed quietly during the war surfaced slowly through memoirs, hearings, and declassified correspondence. With victory secured, there was no longer a need to protect cohesion at any cost. The system began explaining itself. Eisenhower never retracted his decision. In his memoirs, he described Patton as both indispensable and uncontrollable, without softening either term. He acknowledged that Patton's conduct in Sicily was indefensible and stated plainly that, under different circumstances, dismissal would have been unavoidable. The difference, he wrote, was timing. The war did not permit clean choices. The Army's internal reviews reached similar conclusions. Inspector General files confirmed that the incidents met the threshold for formal charges. They also noted that Eisenhower's administrative handling remained within his authority as theater commander. No violation of procedure occurred. What changed was interpretation. The system accepted that discretion had overridden consistency. Medical doctrine moved on without Patton. Combat fatigue became combat exhaustion, then battle stress. Treatment protocols expanded. The Army institutionalized what Patton had rejected without reopening his case. His behavior was categorized as a command failure, not a policy dispute. That distinction mattered. It allowed reform without retroactive judgment. Patton himself never attempted to rehabilitate the incident. In later writings, he expressed regret for the optics, not the premise. He continued to view psychological collapse as corrosive to discipline. He accepted that the Army disagreed. He did not adjust his beliefs to match it. The silence he maintained during the war carried forward into peace. German records provided unintended corroboration of Eisenhower's calculation. Post-war interrogations and operational studies repeatedly highlighted Patton as a disproportionate threat factor. German commanders described reallocating forces based on his movements, often unnecessarily. They confirmed that his reputation altered their decision-making independent of actual contact. This effect persisted until the end of the war. That distortion of enemy behavior did not appear in Allied after-action reports. It emerged later, when German archives became available. Only then did the full strategic value of Patton's continued presence become measurable. Eisenhower could not have cited this evidence at the time. He acted without it. History supplied it afterward. Congress revisited the affair briefly in the late 1940s. The hearings were restrained. The war was over. Patton was dead. Eisenhower was president. No institutional appetite existed to reopen a case whose outcome no longer altered policy or personnel. The record closed without formal resolution. The reputational split endured. Patton entered popular memory as a brilliant but abusive commander. Eisenhower entered as a stabilizer who tolerated excess to preserve effectiveness. Neither image was complete. Both were simplified. What the documents ultimately show is not favoritism, but prioritization. Eisenhower weighed alliance stability, operational tempo, public trust, and individual conduct against each other and accepted imbalance. He did not claim moral clarity. He claimed responsibility. The post-war record does not vindicate the slap. It contextualizes the choice not to prosecute it. It shows a command system operating under conditions where consistency was a luxury and speed was currency. It also shows the cost of that trade, paid later in ambiguity rather than blood. By the time the archives opened, the decision no longer needed defense. The war's outcome had already answered the only question Eisenhower allowed himself to ask at the time: whether the risk he accepted shortened the conflict. The record suggests it did. Stop. The case closes without a hero and without an apology. The slap in Sicily was real. The threat with a pistol was real. No later victory erased either act. Eisenhower never claimed that it did. He treated the incident as a breach that could not be defended and a capability that could not be discarded. Patton was not saved because he was right. He was saved because he was useful in a way no one else was. Eisenhower did not excuse the behavior. He isolated it. He stripped Patton of authority, stalled his career, and exposed him to humiliation rather than law. That choice preserved a tool while signaling limits. It also transferred risk upward. Eisenhower accepted that burden knowingly. The war that followed validated the calculation without cleansing it. Patton accelerated campaigns that would otherwise have slowed. He forced German collapse earlier than attrition alone would have achieved. He also remained disruptive, politically dangerous, and institutionally incompatible even in victory. The system did not reform him. It contained him until it needed him, then contained the consequences afterward. That is the verdict. This was not moral courage. It was command triumph. Eisenhower chose speed over symmetry, effectiveness over example, and control over closure. He preserved an asset at the cost of clarity and lived with the ambiguity until the war ended. History does not need to approve the choice to understand it. The documents are sufficient. The outcomes are measurable. The trade was real. The file is closed. If you want more investigations like this, decisions made behind closed doors, consequences paid in blood and silence, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment if you think Eisenhower chose correctly, or if you think the line should never have bent.